Okay, so the topic today is money multiplier, something that we ended our discussion with in lecture 6.2. And the idea of lecture 6 is essentially to close what we started in lecture 1 at the start of the unit. We discussed money demand there, if you remember, and we discussed a lot about different kinds of theories about money demand. And out here we close that loop by discussing what do we mean by money supply, okay, and how actually the central bank is able to manipulate or influence money supply, which is M1, okay. Before I proceed ahead, any questions on bank balance sheet, any question on commercial bank balance sheet, or central bank balance sheet, or the process of multiple deposit creation? Obviously, we will be discussing all of these things today as well, but if you have any queries that probably were not resolved in the previous two lectures, let me know. Anything? No? Okay. So let's start with the key slide from lecture 6.2. And there we discussed the concept of multiple deposit creation, right? And we said that if the central bank increases reserves, or in other words, monetary base, because monetary base M0 is equal to currency in circulation plus reserves, right? And we said that if the central bank increases reserves, that leads to the process of multiple deposit creation, which increases money supply. First question, how does the central bank achieve an increase in reserves? Simple question. Yeah, open market operations, that's right. Can we get more specific? Open market purchase or open market sale? Purchase, yes. Open market operations essentially overlap or envelop the concept of open market purchase and open market sale by the central bank. What exactly does the central bank do? It conducts open market purchase of securities, which results in an increase in reserves in the banking system. Are we all on board with that idea? That the central bank can dictate directly what the monetary base should be through non-borrowed reserves. Again, what do we mean by non-borrowed reserves and borrowed reserves? Something that we discussed in lecture 6.1 or 6.2, but nonetheless it's important to understand what do we mean by them. Anyone? What do we mean by non-borrowed reserves and what do we mean by borrowed reserves? Any guess? So non-borrowed reserves and borrowed reserves essentially is the concept of supply of reserves. How does the central bank supplies reserves to the banking system? Two ways. One is non-borrowed reserves. You can influence non-borrowed reserves through open market operations. Okay, so this is precisely what we are doing here. The central bank is increasing the non-borrowed component of reserves. The borrowed reserves is simply, if you are commercial banks and I am the central bank, if you want to borrow reserves from me and I'll charge you an interest rate, then which is called discount rate, then that is borrowed reserves. And a simple question, do you think the central bank can influence how much the commercial banks are borrowing from me? Can I influence that? No? Yes? No? Anyone with a yes? Yeah? Why do you think the central bank can control come again? Yeah, that's partly true. That's partly true. Excellent answer. The answer is that by reducing or by manipulating the interest rate that I charge commercial banks, right? If I reduce discount rate, then maybe banks will charge more, banks will borrow more. This is something that we will cover in the next lecture. In general, manipulating discount rate does not affect interbank lending on reserves. We will understand that. Okay, so let's leave it for the next lecture. But in general, central banks are not very effective at controlling the borrowed component of the reserves. They're very effective at controlling the non-borrowed component because they can make open market operations. If they want the non-borrowed component of the reserves to go up, they'll do open market purchases. If they want the non-borrowed component to go down and hence the overall reserves to go down, they'll do open market sales. Okay? Just something to be clear about. Okay. So, where do we begin with? The central bank has conducted open market purchases, and as a consequence, non-borrowed reserves have increased. As a consequence, reserves have increased in the banking system, and then you have this concept of multiple deposit creation, which increases M1. Again, another simple question. Why does multiple deposit creation increase M1 on money supply? Yep.
M1 is currency plus deposit.
Yeah, that's it. Simple. It's not that complicated. Because deposits are increasing, money supply increases. That's it. Are we all clear with this idea? Are we all clear with this consolidated statement of all banks, of all commercial banks in the banking system? Any questions about this? What this table is showing you is that the central bank conducted an open market purchase of $100 of treasury bills, say for example. That increased reserves in Bank A initially. Bank A made loans of that excess reserves. Then somehow the person who borrowed that loan amount wrote a check to someone in Bank B and gave those $100 to Bank B in deposits. Now when Bank B has $100 in deposits, it only needs to hold $10, right? Because we are assuming the required reserve ratio to be 10%. Bank B has $90 in excess reserves now. So Bank B can make a loan of $90, hence increasing one more deposit. That goes to Bank C. Bank C can keep $81 as excess reserves and only keep $9 as required reserves. And this process continues. So just for the clarification, do you think that reserves are increasing in this economy by this multiple deposit creation? Yes, no. When the process of multiple deposit creation is happening, do you think that reserves are increasing? Okay, by how much? Come again? $100. So the increase in reserves is exactly equal to what was at the beginning, right? When the central bank conducted open market purchase, reserves increased by $100. We had this whole multiple deposit creation channel, and then at the end, again, we are left with $100 increase. So reserves do increase, but they don't undergo multiple expansion. It's basically what we started with, a $100 increase in reserves. It's just that these reserves are, going to different banks. Initially, it was with Bank A, then it was with Bank B, then it was with Bank C, and so on and so forth. So you can see that at the end, Bank B is holding $10 in reserves, Bank C is holding $9, Bank D is holding 8.1, and so on and so forth. And if we add all these reserves across all the banks in the banking sector, that'll add up to 100. The key point here is that loans, and as a consequence deposits, increased by 10 times. Okay? And that essentially increases money supply. So, said in a very naive manner, $100 increase in reserves out here has increased $1,000 in deposits. That's a lot. That's saying that you can increase money supply by a factor of 10, okay? And this is an upper bound, this is not real. You don't see these big money multipliers anywhere. This is a theoretical example. Can anyone explain to me why this is a theoretical, hypothetical example, and why we, in general, don't see such large money multipliers?
People don't always put the money into the bank, sometimes they hold it as cash.
People don't deposit all their money in banks, sometimes they hold cash. Yes, one point. Second?
Fractional reserves.
Come again?
Fractional reserves at the commercial bank.
Fractional reserve or fractional reserve banking is essentially why we are having multiple deposit creation. If we have full reserve banking, and if banks hold all of their deposits in terms of reserves, we simply won't have multiple deposit creation, right? So the question is why, I'll come to you. The question is why is money multiplier usually not that large? Yep.
Sometimes banks will choose to hold more than the required reserves.
Yeah, that's the second key point. People hold cash, and banks can hold more than what just the central bank dictates. That's it. And if either of these two things are true, you can understand that this cycle of multiple deposit creation will either be completely stopped, or kind of subdued. Okay, you won't have these large multipliers if banks are not making a loan of say $90, but say for example Bank B is holding $10 as excess reserves as well. In that case, Bank B will only make a loan of $80, and the deposit will increase by $80. And if each and every bank is doing the same thing, then the increase in deposits won't be as large as in the case where no bank is holding any excess reserve, right? Similarly, if someone out here who took the loan of say $90 withdrew that amount as cash, again the whole process stops. You have increase in currency, yes, true, but you don't have multiple increase in currency. There's no channel. So the whole channel of multiple deposit creation will be stalled. Okay? And in that case, your money multiplier won't be as large. Does that make sense? So this is a very simple, basic idea just to drill down the concept of multiple deposit creation. Okay? That's not what happens in reality. What happens in reality, or something close to that, is something that what we will discuss today. One question What happens if the central bank conducts an open market sale? Yes, it reduces the reserves. And as a consequence, yeah. What's the key assumption that we are making here? That, the statement that we made was that the central bank is conducting an open market sale, that decreases reserves, hence that decreases deposits. What's the key assumption here?
The people holding the loans will finally deposit back to the bank.
More importantly, that banks are not holding excess reserves. There is no holding of excess reserves. The idea here is that if banks are holding excess reserves, then they don't have to call loans, right? It's only when banks have zero excess reserves, and if the central bank has conducted an open market sale, reserves would go down and they have to keep minimum required reserves, right? In that case, what do? You jiggle around with your other assets to ensure that you put some in your reserve account. And as a consequence, you call loans. You say, okay, I need to sell $100 of my loans. Or in other words, ask for repayment, even if they're not due. That's bad for a bank as far as reputation is concerned. Imagine you taking a mortgage loan from ANZ for 20 years, and suddenly the bank gives you a deadline, okay, I need all that money back today. I don't know how, but I just need it today. I'm not quite sure if you'll go for that bank again for a loan, right? So that's the problem. But in general, again, we're talking about what happens theoretically if commercial banks don't hold any excess reserves and central bank conducts an open market sale. That will lead to a decrease in reserves, that will lead to a destruction in deposits, and hence money supply will decrease by the same logic. Questions?
Does this mean that a central bank can control money supply another way by, say, increasing the required reserve ratio to above what the banks are?
It used to be. I mean, it used to be 30 years back. That idea is long gone. Now, in fact, central banks have realized that that's not the best way to conduct monetary policy. The required reserve ratio is not the best way to conduct monetary policy, but again, you'll find new articles and interesting articles who discuss how required reserves ratio can be important in increasing the potency of central bank decisions, something that we do not need to go into details. Second question. Do you think the concept of multiple deposit creation will happen if you have only one bank? Just the bank A in the banking system? Yes? Okay. Why?
Doesn't really matter how many banks there are, because if a bank makes a loan, then the person who gets the loan deposits, they're going to deposit in that bank anyway, and that's just created a new.
Okay, that's a potent argument. Let's play a game then. We are Bank A, okay? The Bank A got $100 of excess reserves due to the open market operations. Bank A made a loan of $100 to this person, okay? As a consequence, deposit increased by $100. As of now, the central bank is holding $100 in the reserve account for that bank, Bank A, correct? Now, if this person writes a check to this person, again in Bank A, what will happen to the deposit account of this person? Go down by zero, right? What will happen to the deposit account of this person? Go up by $100. In net, do you think the deposit of Bank A has gone up more than $100? No. Yep.
Why is that different with multiple banks, though?
Good question. Why is it different with multiple banks? The thing with multiple banks is that when this person writes a check to this person who's in Bank B, who holds a deposit in Bank B, the $100 check that comes into this bank increases deposits at Bank B by $100. Right? And when this person, and when Bank B takes $10 as required reserves and then makes a loan of $90 and that goes to Bank C, then that $90 is again new deposit at Bank C. Does that make sense? If the same thing will happen at Bank B, say for example, if the $90 again go in Bank B, the deposits will decrease in Bank B and the other person's deposit account will increase, so it won't really matter. On net, a single bank cannot make loans greater than the excess reserves that it holds. So if Bank A to begin with had $100 of excess reserves, it can't make loans of $1,000. You simply can't do that. But if you have multiple banks, then every time a new bank gets X amount of money, it can keep 10% of that as required reserves and make a loan. You can't do that if you're one single bank in the economy. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What about those two banks? Is that can be achieved?
I mean, the idea is that if there are just two banks, you can achieve this process only to a point, right? The first and the second. If the deposit ultimately goes back to the same bank and you keep, the point is it doesn't matter whether it happens after one iteration or 10. The key of multiple deposit creation here is that you're assuming that there are a lot of banks in the banking system. That loans that are being made to someone are ultimately going to some new bank. It's very much possible that the example that we discussed, this person made a loan to this person, wrote a check to this person, that won't increase the money multiplier. But if this person then ultimately spends the money and that money goes to some other bank, which it eventually will, that is when multiple deposit creation happens. So it's not necessary that this kind of a sequential game happens in reality. It might be the case that the first two deposits are in the same bank, but the third deposit is in some other bank. And then the fourth deposit is in some other bank, and so on and so forth. Question?
So with the multiple bank scenario, why is it the case that when, say, someone from Bank A writes a check to someone from Bank B, why are the deposits in Bank A going down when going up in Bank B?
I didn't get that question. Can you repeat that?
So you said that it wouldn't work with a single bank because if someone wrote a check to someone, then the deposits would decrease in the first person by the same amount it would increase in the second person. So it'll be zero change.
Yeah.
So why is that different when, say, Bank A writes a check to Bank B? Why isn't Bank A going down and Bank B going up? So the change is zero.
There was a query on how multiple deposit creation cannot happen with a single bank, right? All right. Now, in this case, what did we say? We said that Bank A makes a $100 loan against these excess reserves to a person P1 and deposits the amount in P1's account at Bank A, right? Is that all good? Now, in the case of multiple banks, what happens? P1 writes a check of $100 to P2, and that is deposited at Bank B because P2 holds a deposit account at Bank B. Now, to your question, does the deposit not go down? It does, see? Bank A, the deposit account goes down to 0. It's 0, back to 0. At the same time, there's no reserve as well, because reserves also get out, right? So reserves get to 0, deposits get to 0, the final balance sheet is something like this. The securities decrease by $100 and ultimately loans increase by $100. So did the deposits decrease when you had a deposit withdrawal? Yes, you did. Okay? Now what happens? At Bank B, there's an extra deposit of $100. This is the key thing. This is the new deposit. Okay? Now with this $100 deposit, you also get a $100 reserve, right? With this extra reserve, now what's the extra reserves with Bank B? Is it $100? Is it $99? Is it something else? Assuming required reserve ratio of 10%. How many excess reserves does the Bank B have? 90? 90? Yeah, exactly, right? Now what does the Bank B do with those excess reserves? It'll make a loan. It'll make a loan to P3, a different person, who writes a check to P4, again a different person, in Bank C. What happens now? Initially, Bank B, and you can write this down if you want to, Bank B, we are not showing this out here, Bank B would have deposited $90 in the name of P3, correct? Am I right? And then P3 would have very quickly wrote a check to P4. And that's why initially the deposits increased by $190 for Bank B, but then decreased back to 100. Does that make sense? But what's the key point out here? Where did the $90 go? To Bank C. And that was a new deposit. And this cycle continues. Okay? So yes, the deposits do go down every time there's a withdrawal. But the deposit that P2 made with Bank B is still there. Correct? Similarly, the deposit that P4 made to Bank C would always be there. That's the creation of multiple deposits. But in the case of, so is this clear?
Yeah, that's fixed.
Yeah? Now, in the case of just one bank, Bank A, what happens now? Bank A made the loan to P1, the deposit increased by $100. Now what happens when this guy writes a check to P2, but now P2 does not hold an account with Bank B? Where does P2 hold an account with? A, right? Because there's only one bank in the system. So what happens now? We don't even need to move to the next slide. What happens now? Exactly. Is that a new deposit? Will the bank receive some extra reserves?
It's just moving from one account.
One account to the other. P1's deposit will decrease by $100 and P2's deposit will increase by $100. Is there a net new deposit? That's it. Simple as that. Okay? So this was the simple deposit multiplier, where we said that the change in deposits is equal to the change in reserves, which is 100, into 1 minus the required reserve ratio, which was 90, into 1 minus R squared, which is 81, and so on and so forth, right? And the sum of the series is essentially equal to delta R by the required reserve ratio. Okay? So if required reserve ratio is 10% or 0.10, then the deposits in general, the change in deposits will be delta R by RR, correct? What's the change in monetary base? Just the change in R. What's the change in money supply? Change in D. What's the money multiplier then, which is the change in money supply divided by change in monetary base? Just the reciprocal of the reserve requirement ratio, right? Again, this is a very simple deposit multiplier. Now, let's bring in things that we want to discuss in terms of the real world. We have some people holding cash. We have some banks holding excess reserves. What does the money multiplier look like in that case? So to begin with, let's define small c as the currency to deposit ratio. Okay, that's the total currency in circulation in the banking system divided by the total deposits in the banking system. Then we have the excess reserves ratio. Now the excess reserves ratio is exactly what it means. The total excess reserves that all commercial banks hold divided by the total deposits in the banking system. And the required reserves is, as we already know, the total minimum reserves that banks are supposed to hold divided by the total deposits. And what we are saying here is that the money multiplier in that case is equal to 1 plus the currency ratio, currency to deposit ratio, divided by the required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio plus the currency ratio. Okay? And the caveat here is that the excess reserves plus the required reserves is less than 1. What happens if the excess reserves plus the required reserves is equal to 1?
It just becomes 1 because you need 1 more capital and same.
Yeah, and we are basically in the case of full reserve banking. You're holding all your deposits as reserves, either as minimum reserves or excess reserves. How do we get this? It's a pretty straightforward proof. We just express money supply M1 in terms of these ratios. We express monetary base in terms of these ratios, and then we divide them. That's it. So the first step is money supply M1. What is money supply? It is currency plus deposits. So we can write that simply, we can write currency C as simply equal to the currency ratio into deposits, right? That's straightforward, plus deposits. So that's 1 plus C into the total deposits. What's monetary base? Monetary base is currency plus the total reserves. And what's the total reserves equal to? That's equal to the minimum reserves that banks hold plus the excess reserves. And if you express both, all currency, Rmin and Re in terms of ratios, you can write that as C into D, RR into D, and E into D, which basically is C plus RR plus E. Divide 1 by 2 and you get the ratio M1 by M2 is 1 plus C divided by C plus RR plus E. In other words, what we are saying here is that if monetary base in the economy is $1 billion and money supply is $1.5 billion, what do you think is the money multiplier? 1.5, that's it. And that's a marginal case. Essentially what we're saying is, if this is true, if money supply is $1.5 billion and the monetary base is $1 billion, then if the central bank increases reserves by $100, money supply will increase by $150. That does not mean that if the central bank increases monetary base by $1 trillion, the money supply will increase by $1.5 trillion. Because then we are changing a lot of things, and the magnitude is changing by a lot. And then you're not really sure what's happening because other coefficients may start changing as well. So it's a marginal case. In this case, the money multiplier is 1 plus C divided by C plus RR plus E. And you can see, just for your practice, that if you put positive coefficients to say C, if say currency in holdings is 50% of deposits, and if the excess reserves are 10% of deposits, you won't find the money multiplier to be that big. It won't be 10. It'll be something like 2, 3 at most. If excess reserves ratio is increasing, the denominator will increase, and money multiplier can be even less than 1. Questions? Okay. So let's talk about quantitative easing and apply this theory to test. We start with the concept of money multiplier that we have just achieved. And the key point to take away is that when you have recessions, money multipliers don't behave the way they're supposed to. Okay? So an example is if you look at global financial crisis that started at the fall of 2007, the US Fed engaged large-scale asset purchases, essentially open market purchases, that increases reserves by a tremendous amount. And between 2007 and 2014, the Fed increased reserves by a large amount. This large-scale asset purchase program was termed as quantitative easing. By June 2014, the Fed had increased the monetary base by nearly 400%. This is the monetary base at the start of 2007. This is the monetary base at the end of 2014. So, in line with our theory, the central bank is completely able to influence what the monetary base looks like, right? It has complete control over the monetary base. Not so much the money supply. Money supply, M1, increased only by 110% during the same period. That's a very small money multiplier, isn't it? In the textbook example, we said a $100 increase results in a $100 increase in reserves results in a $1,000 increase in deposits. Out here, a $100 increase in monetary base is resulting in only 1/4 the increase in money supply. That's a very small money multiplier. That's how wrong basic economic theory can be sometimes. What explains this? Anyone? Any guesses? Yeah.
Maybe the banks were trying to be really risk averse and they were just holding on to those.
In a nutshell, yes. Banks were risk averse. They were holding all the excess reserves. So we can all go home now. We have the answer. If you want a bit more detail into this discussion, that's exactly what happened. Currency ratio is pretty stable. The currency to deposit ratio is pretty stable throughout this period. I mean, it went down, but it was the excess reserves ratio, E, which is the total excess reserves that banks hold divided by the total deposits, that shot up by 2 orders of magnitude, maybe 3. And you can see it was practically zero before the financial crisis. Banks were not holding excess reserves. And then suddenly, together with quantitative easing, you have an explosion in the excess reserves ratio. And you can see here that if E becomes really large, the money multiplier would become really small, because E comes here in the denominator. So as we saw in the previous slide, it was the extraordinary rise in the excess reserve ratio which climbed by more than a factor of 1,000 during this period. And so we now understand why the money multiplier was so small. Why do you think the excess reserves ratio increased by this large amount? One reason, obviously, is the fact that banks were a bit skeptical about making loans. Anything else? Come again? Yeah. So supply of loans was down, and the demand for loans was down as well. You need people to demand loans. Who will you give loans to if no one is asking for loans? Come again? No one. Yeah, good answer. So the first possible reason, obviously, is that quantitative easing, or QE, as it is often referred to, injected far more reserves in the banking system than what the banking system actually needed. That's what I meant by the idea that the money multiplier that we created earlier on, 1 plus C divided by RR plus E plus C, is valid if you are making an increment of $100, but not if you're making an increment of $1 trillion. Things change when you're making that big an increase. Other ratios can change. The second thing is that Fed began paying interest on excess reserves starting from 2008. And as a consequence, commercial banks were very happy to hold very large amount of excess reserves because they were practically being paid to hold excess reserves. Initially, there was no payment, there was no interest payment on excess reserves. Yeah.
Why did the Fed do that?
Why did the Fed engaged in paying? Stop or started? One possible reason, again, I don't sit in the Fed board. Some of my friends do. Maybe I'll ask them. One reason was that the Fed is conducting large-scale asset purchases, right? And banks know that their reserves are being bloated by great proportions. That is one incentive. That's an incentive for the central bank to go ahead and be able to do asset purchases. See, banks are not oblivious to the fact that if they engage in open market purchases by the central bank, their reserves, their excess reserves will bloat. So this was an incentive for the banks to play along, right? Because if I am a large commercial bank, and if I'm holding, say, for example, treasury securities, I would probably hold treasury securities than keep excess reserves. Why? Yeah, I'll probably get a good return out of treasury securities. Yeah.
Wouldn't encouraging excess reserves just defeat the purpose of the open market operation, right?
Yeah, Yeah, it did, kind of. But the idea here is that, I mean, let's not, my suggestion would be, it's not just that. Initially, right after the financial crisis, there was no liquidity in the system. So the Fed engaged in large-scale asset purchases to inject liquidity. That was correct. No question about that. The question is, how far should you go? How long should you continue quantitative easing? That's a question we are still trying to answer. You see? Initially, the system required liquidity, yes, and that's why the Fed was engaged in large-scale asset purchases, because the whole idea was that if the system is devoid of any liquidity, it'll just crumple, it'll go down. But how far do you continue with quantitative easing is altogether a different question. And how large your quantitative easing should be is again altogether a different question. The third point is something that we have already discussed. In an economic downturn, commercial banks suffer losses, which is true. Commercial banks did suffer tremendous losses. And as a consequence, what will you do? You'll stop lending. That's a pretty straightforward response. You won't lend more because you're already having non-performing assets. Non-performing assets basically means loans that are not paying. Okay, you've given a loan to a person and that person is not paying you back. Why? We will discuss that in detail in lecture 11. Fourth, there is an increase in asymmetric information. Again, what do we mean by asymmetric information? Moral hazard and adverse selection. Can someone define what moral hazard is? And consequently, what adverse selection is?
Moral hazards when you have an incentive to break agreement. And then adverse selection is the difference in knowledge between the buyer and the seller or transactions.
No, not really. Yep.
Adverse selection is like you cannot define which borrower in the market is a good borrower.
Come again?
You cannot identify which borrower in the market is a good borrower.
Yeah. Adverse selection is the problem of selecting someone who will default on the loan that you give to that person. It's just lending to the wrong person. Moral hazard is you lending to the person, that's okay, but then he or she does things that he or she is not supposed to. Adverse selection happens before you make the loan or do the transaction. Moral hazard happens after the transaction is made. Right? Moral hazard is, say, for example, I make a loan to someone who says that he or she is making a new, app. And I think that that's a worthy investment, and I give him or her that amount, whatever the amount is. Now, what happens if that person goes to a casino to gamble that money? His idea is that if he wins, he'll get 100 times the return, and he'll just pay me the principal together with a very small interest, and if he loses, he loses. I'm the one who's taking the loss. That is moral hazard. That is, the borrower engages in an activity that's detrimental to the lender. And in a financial crisis, when banks and firms and businesses are not doing that well, they can engage in more risky activity just to ensure that they somehow save the day, right? Because their balance sheets are all red, their bets are going down, and they have this incentive to risk even further to save themselves. And in that case, the problem of asymmetric information increases. As a consequence, banks are skeptical of lending in the economy, and the supply of loans go down. And the final point is again something that we have discussed, and that is that if we are in a recession and if businesses are not finding profitable opportunities, then people won't demand loan. This basic balance sheet idea fails if people are not taking loans, right? And that's essentially why during this period of 2007 and 2014, you didn't see the increase in money supply as much as Fed wanted, or as much as Fed would have wanted. What's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that, yes, we understand this beautiful concept of multiple deposit creation. It's really nice to learn. Then we understand that that's an upper bound. It's unreasonable to expect that money multiplier is 10. Then we understand that, we introduce the concept of cash ratio, excess reserve ratio, and then we define a new multiplier. We say it's 1 plus C divided by RR plus E plus C. And that's fine for this unit. But if you go beyond this, and if you're giving an interview, maybe at an accounting firm, in an investment bank, or a central bank, it's worth understanding that money multiplier does not work in that way. Especially in times of crisis, things change, ratios can change. Firms and businesses and commercial banks' behavior can change, which results in the change of these ratios, right? So when we are saying money multiplier M is equal to blah, blah, and blah, we are assuming that everything else is constant. And the only thing that you're changing is reserves, and that will simply be multiplied by that multiplier. In general, not true. For quizzes and exams, true, but beyond that, when you step in the real world to understand how money supply happens, a lot of caveats attached. Yeah.
Does that mean likewise in times of really big economic boom that the multiplier can be bigger than what we're seeing?
Yeah. Banks do not want to hold excess reserves. They're like, who will, keep money lying around? I'll rather invest in a loan and make greater returns. Yes, precisely. In a boom, money multiplier can be large. But again, a lot of caveats attached to that. How much amount of borrowing is happening, how much amount of lending is happening, and so on and so forth. Any questions? Yep.
If people, if the bank put money and then make a loan to someone like people A, and then people A will deposit their money to bank B, right? But actually the loan rate is also always higher than the deposit rate. So how can they make any profit?
Come again?
So the rate that bank make a loan is always higher than the rate the bank deposit, the deposit rate.
The deposit, so the interest rate that the bank makes on deposits is always less than the interest rate that the bank charges on loans. So that is how the bank will make a profit.
Yeah, but actually, if the people they borrow from the bank, if the interest rate that they repay from the bank is higher than the interest rate they get from the deposit, why is it still depositing to the bank?
Oh, why do you deposit into the bank? That's true. I mean, but the question is, why do you deposit? Because you're not a financial intermediary. You can make greater returns than just getting now what, 1 point something % in the commercial bank deposit rates, but then you have to lend the money directly. If you are depositing money in a commercial bank, you're just being safe. That's why you accept a lower interest rate. That's why savers accept lower interest rate, because the commercial bank is doing the hard work for you. The commercial bank is like, hey, give me your money, I'll give you some interest rate, but since I'm doing all the hard work, I need to make profit. I'm the commercial bank, I'm identifying who to give the loan to, I'm taking the risk, and hence I'm charging a high interest rate on that person. You are the saver, you just deposit money into the bank. That's why you deposit money in bank and accept a lower interest rate.
Yeah, I guess means the process is not through one person. It's
Yeah.
maybe like four more persons there.
Yeah, I mean, there are many people there are many small individual savers in the economy, okay? They individually cannot go and lend money to the borrowers, precisely because there are huge transaction costs. If you, for example, want to start lending money, you will incur a large transaction cost in terms of finding people, doing applications, legal fees, etc., etc. So that is why you and a lot of other small savers don't start making loans directly. What you do is all of you put your savings into the bank, that's the deposit, and the bank then starts making the loans. In the process, what the bank is doing, the bank is paying you small interest, the depositor, and is charging a great interest from the person who's taking a loan from the bank. The difference is the profit. Okay? Any other question? No? Excellent. See you next week.